Hi, I'm going to provide you with something I call a shortcut or a guide to the readings. As you'll see at the bottom of Module 1 and the top of Module 2, I have posted 3 readings. They're actually chapters from various books about media ethics. And the reason I've chosen chapters as opposed to full textbooks is because I like these chapters for their context and their background, exploring what we mean by ethics principles and some of the philosophers. But they use case studies that may be somewhat dated and somewhat unfamiliar to you. I like to use these as context and then find my own case studies as I go through the New York Times and various blogs throughout the day. So I use published chapters on ethics and then my own case studies. As you can see, there are 3 readings, and I recommend reading them in this order. Applying 4 theories is really sort of the most simplistic, and then they get a little bit more comprehensive as we move along. However, there is one thing you should keep in mind as you're reading through these chapters, and that is, even though they cover various approaches, we're really going to distill it down to 3. We're going to use virtue-based ethics, duty-based ethics, as well as consequence-based ethics. Okay, the field of ethics obviously is very complex, and if this were a social ethics or a philosophy course, we'd be going into a lot more depth. But really, we are going to extract the principles as a way of sort of thinking about approaching media ethics cases, and just use these as ideas and as rationales. So, as you're reading these chapters, think about a virtue-based ethics. And you'll see a lot of synonyms for these, and this refers to a golden mean, and it's associated with the philosopher Aristotle. And it really sort of focuses on character and making choices that are a balancing point between 2 extremes. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. You may recall this very tragic incident that happened nearly 2 summers ago when a young news reporter and her photographer were murdered in cold blood by a former disgruntled employee of the same television station. He stalked them and found them at a live news shoot and gunned them down. And in fact, as you can see in the news leader here, that was a picture that was taken off of the cameraman's camera as he turned to see who the assailant was. Okay, so these are various photographs among probably a dozen that were culled by various newspapers and wire services. And so newspapers have the option to, pull from these selections and use whatever they choose on their front pages. And you can see these are 3 very different choices that were made by various newspapers in the state of Virginia. So if you were using this virtue approach to selecting an appropriate photograph for your front page, I suggest to you that the one that the Virginia Pilot selected, Tragedy in Real Time, that depicts the victims and much more happier times, obviously, that this was really sort of a good balance between 2 extremes. Obviously, the one extreme is the murderer in cold blood himself, which is really quite disturbing and very unsettling. And then maybe the other extreme would be something like maybe the state of shock, which removes itself a little bit. It's pictures of the community, Virginians in mourning. Okay, so when we talk about 2 extremes, we think more of really negative things, but it could just be represent sort of a spectrum, and the photograph accompanying Tragedy in Real Time really is that sort of balance point. It honors the victims in this case. Okay, duty-based, and you'll read a lot more about this, is associated with the philosopher Kant, and it really is this sense of sort of moral duty. And it has a strict sense of what's right and what's wrong, and it's not concerned with consequences or outcomes. And so here, if you were approaching this from sort of a duty-based perspective, you probably would choose either the Virginia Pilot or the Roanoke Times. I mean, because you have a real commitment with doing what's morally right. Consequence-based approach, that's associated with the philosophers Mill and Bentham, and sometimes you see it referred to as utilitarianism, and it's the whole idea of promoting the greatest good and the least amount of harm for the greatest number of people. So again, using these three front pages, maybe a consequence-driven approach would select the Roanoke Times because it minimizes harm for the greatest number of people. Obviously, we wouldn't use the News Leader. And the Virginia Pilot with the pictures of the victims, that could be very harmful for the victims' families and their friends and the television community. So maybe you would select the Roanoke Times, the state of shock photograph, because it really sort of minimizes the most harm. One thing you should keep in mind about ethics is there's really no right or wrong answer. It's just important to acquire the tools with which to support and argue your response. Finally, and we're not going to really use Machiavelli actively, but the last article talks about Machiavelli. And he's associated with this idea of pragmatic ethics and this notion of the ends justify the means. And when we think about the application of Machiavelli and media ethics, we think about maybe, choosing a story or a photograph that's the most sensational, that will, give us the highest ratings or give us the highest readership and circulation. And so we think of Machiavellian ethics as really very self-serving. Very sort of, success-driven. All right, well, this is just a quick guide to trying to make sense of the readings and the kinds of things you should focus on. Again, that would be virtue, duty, and consequence ethics.